Afghanistan has, it's what, past 175 years, thrown the British out twice, the Russians out once, and the Americans out once.
Afghans have had families on both sides of the Durand Line, and they continue to marry across the border. For
Right.
most Afghans, for most Pashtuns, I should say, the Durand Line does not exist.
The Pakistani army is almost the last remnant of the Raj that kind of believes in the forward policy of defense. As soon as the Taliban took over, they immediately began dressing their troops in American uniforms, and marching around, riding in American Humvees and stuff. It's like you did not win the war by using this advanced equipment, but as soon as you got it.
Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Thomas Barfield, a professor at the Boston University, also a walking encyclopedia on Afghanistan. Thomas, thank you again for speaking to Fair Observer.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so what I really want to talk about is the ongoing clashes between the Taliban in Afghanistan and the Pakistani army. And we're seeing that the clashes are escalating, and this is mostly happening on the border. Why do you think these clashes have intensified?
Well, they've intensified because the Afghan government under the Taliban has given refuge to the Tehrik-i-Taliban, which is sometimes called the Pakistani Taliban. They see them as brothers in arms, and to some extent, having won the jihad in Afghanistan, they see no reason not to extend it to Pakistan. There's also ethnic relationships, since both Tehrik-i-Taliban and the Taliban themselves are predominantly Pashtun. So they share, an ethnic tie, which has historically been hostile to the Pakistani state in Islamabad.
Right. And what's interesting is that these clashes have escalated more since Taliban came to power in 2021. How was it like before that, before the Taliban was controlling Afghanistan? Were these clashes frequent?
Well, no. When the American-backed government was there, Pakistan was supporting the Taliban and attacking Afghanistan. And the Americans were going after Tehrik-i-Taliban and other, what they saw, Islamist groups that were against Islamabad. So there were no attacks from Afghanistan mounted into Pakistan in the 20 years that the American-backed government was there. If any, it was the opposite direction.
Right.
Pakistan was hoping to replace that government with a Taliban government, and it got its wish.
But, I mean, explain to our audience how that happened. So on one hand, you've got Pakistan, who wanted a Taliban government in Kabul. Now that did happen in 2021. What's happening? Why are they fighting? If this is what Pakistan wanted, why aren't they getting the results that they wanted?
It's what you want is not always what you get. This is a replay of when Pakistan supported the Taliban in the 1990s. And at that time referred to Afghanistan as a fifth province. But when Mullah Omar supported Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda attacked the United States said it would invade Afghanistan unless Mullah Omar turned over Osama bin Laden. And Pakistan said, do it, all right? What do you owe him? And if the Americans come in, it ruins 20 years of our policy. And the Taliban refused. The Americans invaded, and all the effort that Pakistan had put into getting a client government was gone. So they went back to zero and said, let's support the Taliban again. But what they hadn't thought about is the Taliban made good clients as long as they needed Pakistan to take power. Once they had taken power, they reverted back to a lot of opposition, things like they were not going to sign the Durand Line, agree to the Durand Line. They considered it illegitimate. But also they felt that other Islamist groups like the Tehrik-i-Taliban were brothers in arms. So they deserved to be supported. And if you were going to fight a new jihad, what better place to do it in one of the world's largest Muslim countries that's a nuclear power? Anyway, what are you going to do with excess suicide bombers? Okay, so they needed a new fight, and they sent them there. So, but from the Taliban's point of view, they never considered themselves loyal to, to Pakistan, and particularly given the ethnic differences. There were a number of people within Pakistan in the Northwest Frontier Province, as it was called at that time, who would agree with the Taliban that they didn't want to be part of Pakistan. So there was a strong base to begin with.
Yeah, it's interesting how things have played out, because in 2021, when the Taliban did come into power, there was this famous visual of the then ISI chief, going to Kabul, having tea with members of the Taliban. And then fast forward to 5 years now, and both sides are engaged in heavy clashes. In fact, in February, basically last month, Pakistan carried out airstrikes in Kabul, in Kandahar, and 2 other provinces in Nangarhar. Well, the Taliban say that they're going to keep fighting Pakistan. Where do you think this conflict is going? Do you think Pakistan is going to be bold enough to launch a ground offensive? Or do you think that this is how it's going to be in a protracted war?
Well, that's Pakistan's dilemma, because Afghanistan is not threatening a conventional war against them. It's threatening with an insurgency,
right?
Which is something they know how to do. And they're well armed because they got all these weapons from the Americans and NATO that left them behind. But beyond that, their strategy kind of is, in some ways, think twice. It's easy to invade Afghanistan. The problem is what happens after your troops reach Kandahar and Kabul. And Pakistan's got a dilemma there, because if they were to move in, their former allies are the people that were running it. What are they going to do? Go back to Massoud's son or the old government and say, we wish they were back? There's been some talk that they actually have been in touch with Afghan insurgents in Tajikistan and other things, but and you also have to remember that the Taliban itself is divided into factions. There's the conservative religious faction in Kandahar, and there's the Zadrans, but who are also Islamists, but they're not clerics, and they run Kabul. So there's differences in within Afghanistan. But the problem for Pakistan is it's not clear that Zadrans, who used to be very closely related during the Soviet war with their father to the Pakistani intelligence network, now they have these close relationships with Islamists and others. It's not clear that they would be as cooperative. So does Pakistan even have a faction that you could go for a coup or some kind of change or something like? So they're really caught in a dilemma, which it's of their own making, but I'm not sure how they resolve it, because to some extent they can be in Kabul in 2 days. All right, they've got a army. You just march in. In the 1990s, when the Iranian consulate in Mazar Sharif was destroyed and some of their diplomats murdered, the Iranians massed 300,000 troops along the border when Mullah Omar was in charge and threatened to invade. But they were careful to get simply the Taliban to back down on some things and never decided to cross the border. But that's Pakistan's dilemma. It has the military power to be, to take the cities. And in some senses, that might even be popular with some of the people, particularly living in Kabul. But who do you put in the government? How do you make it work? And fighting an insurgency, as the Americans saw, is expensive and long-term. And Pakistan's got enough trouble at home without picking up a new insurgency, and now it's got troubles on its Iranian border. So when troubles come, it's sort of monsoon season for troubles. Okay, what can you say? And it's just a downpour. So Pakistan got a lot of balls to juggle, in part because, remember, they signed a strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia, and so because the Saudis are being attacked. What if they decide to join the America? I mean, there's all kinds of balls in the air right now. And dealing with Afghanistan alone would have been difficult enough. But when you combine it with these other things, and troubles within Pakistan's domestic politics, it's really a hard time for its military.
Yeah, well, one of the interesting things that's come out is that the Afghan Taliban has said they don't intend to use drones. They're happy doing suicide bombings and causing damage to the Pakistani army. So I wanted to get a sense of your understanding. How costly is this conflict going to remain? Because we already know that hundreds of people have already been killed this year.
Yeah.
And if you look at the conflict over the last 3 to 4 years, thousands have been killed.
It got worse, but remember, Pakistan sent 1 million Afghans back to Afghanistan. Many of those people
Right.
have been in Pakistan. They lived there. Iran did the same thing. So Pakistan, in some senses, they did that to sort of as retaliation to Pakistan, to Afghanistan. Is we're going to send these people back and cause you a problem. The difficulty was the Taliban were not really concerned about the status. Government is not their responsibility as far as they're concerned. They don't really worry about the economy or other things. They do worry about their financial position, but that was one of the things that Pakistan never had the money to have that kind of leverage, to say, we'll fund your army or we'll give you aid. If anything, India has been sneaking in the back door, talking about providing aid, to the Taliban, and that certainly frightens Pakistan, because that's the one thing they wanted, was to keep India out. And what do their old allies do? They immediately say, well, we can deal just as well with Delhi as we can with Islamabad. We have Afghanistan, not the Taliban, but Afghanistan has a long history of doing that. So in that sense, they fall back into old Afghan patterns of they've always gotten along better with Delhi than they have with Islamabad, in part because of the problem of what they call Pashtunistan and other leftover issues of the partition that were never satisfactorily from the Afghan point of view.
Yes, so I want you to talk to us more about this idea of Pashtunistan. It's not an idea. I would say it's much more than that, because when Pakistan deported millions of Afghans, one sticking point, one sore point was that Afghans have had families on both sides of the Durand Line, and they continue to marry across the border. For
Right.
most Afghans, for most Pashtuns, I should say, the Durand Line does not exist. And this border has been disputed since the 19th century. Do you ever think that there can be a solution to this?
In some ways, it's been going on since 1893 when it was first signed. And the one thing that every Afghan government has in common is they've all rejected it.
Right.
They accepted it as long as the British were there, all right, because it was sort of sphere of influence. But the problem arose when the Afghans said, well, if the Raj is leaving, then why should the subcontinent be divided up into two? That the Pashtuns should have an opportunity, independent state, join Afghanistan, join Pakistan. And the idea of just melding them into Pakistan, the Afghans said, wait a minute, our agreement was with the British, not with this new state of Pakistan, and they refused to recognize it. They do recognize it as de facto border. If anything, it actually was useful for raising funds, because goods would be imported across the Durand Line, destined for Afghanistan, and then immediately smuggled back into Pakistan without paying taxes. So in some ways, the border was useful, but the reason it never became a sticking point to some extent was the people who lived along the border could walk across it, intermarry, they own land. And it's only later, when Pakistan keeps pushing that it is a real border, and the Afghans refuse. The kings refused, Dawood Republic refused, the communists refused, the old Taliban refused, the Republic refused, and now the new Taliban are refusing. Those are ideological stripes, but the one thing all agree on is, no, we won't agree to that.
Can you explain that a little bit more for our international audience? Because that's really fascinating, that regardless of whoever has been governing Afghanistan, sitting in Kabul, whether it's the Taliban, whether it's the communists, whether it's the elected government, the Durand Line has always been a non-negotiable for them. Can you tell us more about that? Why has that happened?
It was in 1893, the sort of the large Pashtun ethnic group on what was until recently called the Northwest Frontier. The British did not want to take the responsibility of ruling them directly. They'd already lost the first Anglo-Afghan war, lost an army coming out, and what they wanted was control, let's say, of the Khyber Pass. So what they did was control that, pay off the tribes on either side, and then after they'd taken the Punjab, and then, because it was the Sikhs who were ruling Peshawar at the time, so the British take over from that. And then they decide, we don't want to rule this directly, but we got to draw a frontier. So since they had put an Afghan government into power with Emir Abdur Rahman, they said, we'll pay you more in terms of subsidies. This is a line, we're going to impose it. And it runs all the way from the Pamirs down to Baluchistan. And Mr. Durand wrote, okay. So the Afghans were more or less forced to accept it. But what it did was divide the Pashtun population, ethnic group, kind of in half. And one half, or actually more than one half in population, was on the British side. The other side was the Afghan side. So you had British direct rule territory, which was like in places like Peshawar in the city, and then the quote, the tribal zone, which British political officers would work with local tribal leaders. They paid them subsidies. And then across the Durand Line, that was the Afghans were in charge, but their government didn't actually attempt to rule it. So to some extent, this has historically been an ungoverned area. And these ungoverned people who live in that area have never been happy with either state. But as soon as Pakistan came into existence, the Afghans said, they made an issue of it. They claimed that all the agreements they signed with the British were now null and void, and they needed a new agreement with Pakistan. They began drawing maps that showed Pashtunistan going all the way to the Indus River and down to Karachi. That's a pretty big claim, and not all of it's Pashtun. But from Pakistan's point of view, it looked like, Afghanistan was seeking to dismember it. The interesting thing was Afghanistan, if you created an independent Pashtun state, is it part of Afghanistan? Because if they had absorbed that, then the Pashtuns in Afghanistan would be a minority to those on the Pakistan side. So it was always a game that they wanted freedom for the Pashtuns in Pakistan, but it was really unclear what their relationship would be with Afghanistan. So it's a fuzzy issue, but the main thing was they were looking for autonomy, if not independence. And that struck a chord with Pashtuns in that area who saw the Pakistani government as dominated by Punjabis or Sindhis. They were on the losing end of that. So now, there were many, particularly in the military, there's certainly on occasion Pakistani leaders who were Pashtun. It's not, a zero-sum game. But it's one of the things that Pakistan has always assumed: if you get a government in Kabul, it could get the government to recognize the border. And the Afghans said, well, there's co-ethnics on both sides. That never stopped them from signing an agreement with Russia to demarcate the Central Asian border, or with the Iranian border that the British drew. Right? Those also have co-ethnics. But I refer to it Peshawar, which used to be the winter capital of the Afghan state. I've called it the phantom limb in Afghanistan. They lost it 170 years ago, but they still feel the pain. In other areas, where the Baluch border is, or where the Iranian border is, or the border with Uzbekistan, that's gone, done. They don't worry about that. But this border it's a living issue. And since the people on the inside, on both sides of the border, have historically been ungoverned and the source of insurgencies that all states have found difficult to control, that's one of the difficulties of putting it together, is that there's no consensus, and even the people there are kind of anti-state of all varieties.
Yeah. Well, the way you've explained, Thomas, is that the Durand Line is largely a Pashtun issue. And rightly, Pakistan has Punjabis, Siddhis, Baltis, Gilgit, people from Gilgit. And on the other side, in Afghanistan, of course, about 34 to 40% are Pashtuns, but then you've also got Tajiks, you've got Uzbeks, you've got Hazaras. So how do these other ethnicities, other ethnic groups see the issue of the Durand Line? Because clearly the conflict over Durand Line has affected them as well.
It has, and they would probably settle, saying we have arbitrary borders in our areas. But remember that Afghanistan has always had a Pashtun ruler, and that didn't change when the Americans came in and Hamid Karzai there. So the governments of Afghanistan, the one thing they've had in common is the executive. If Pakistan really wanted a settlement of the Durand Line, it probably should have pushed more for more diversity within the Afghan government. If you'd had a Tajik president or an Uzbek president, he might have said, you know, it's been like this for a long time. There's a lot of things that we don't like, but they probably would have done it. But the fact is that the Pashtuns since 1747 have maintained dominance within Afghanistan. And that's one of the, you know, so that Pashtun ethnic issue gets pushed up to a national issue. So even if they're probably you know, a plurality in Afghanistan, not a majority, although they've never done a census, it's hard to say. But the key thing is that, and particularly Ashraf Ghani at the end of the Republic, he kept pushing a more Pashtun nationalist line. And of course, the Taliban themselves are almost entirely Pashtun. I mean, their entire cabinet are Pashtuns. So for them, it's like a no-brainer. That's, we don't care, you know, we care about that frontier. We don't care so much about Herat or Mazar Sharif or these other, but we do care about this. We've got co-ethnics on both sides of the border. The Zadrans who are ruling in Kabul on both sides of the border, and they spent a lot of time on the Pakistan side during the war against the Soviets and others. They have very, very close ties there. So in addition to political things, there's also even personal links that the groups that are ruling Afghanistan have good reason to see the thing as a single unit because they got relatives on both sides. So
right. Well, it's interesting how you've just explained that, because if I was a general in the Pakistani army, if I was heading Pakistan, I would much rather have a Tajik or an Uzbek or a Hazara sitting in Kabul, because it's easier to negotiate with them on the Durand Line. They don't really have families across the border, unlike the Pashtuns. However, Pakistan's strategic depth doctrine has been the total opposite. They've always wanted somebody who's from the Pashtun ethnic group to be running from Kabul. How does that make sense?
Well, it's because they're the transporter people, all right? So having them in, that's what they think about strategic depth. And then the rest of these people sit on, you know, the periphery. So that's how they define it. And second, yes, the Tajik or an Uzbek might be more accommodating to Pakistan, but Pakistan worries that might be even more accommodating to India. So, you know, that's a worry there. So, but it's almost, the Pakistani army is almost the, you know, the last remnant of the Raj that kind of believes in the forward policy of defense, because defense of India begins, you know, on the northern slope of the Hindu Kush, you know, that. And times have changed, right? But the idea of thinking about Afghanistan as a frontier defense, still in Pakistan's strategic doctrine. But beyond that, it's also, I think it's a hubris that the British, you know, learned the hard way, you know, you should restrain yourself from acting on when they invaded Afghanistan, is that they could control the people in the country. And, you know, Afghanistan has, it's what, past 175 years, thrown the British out twice, the Russians out once, and the Americans out once, right?
Right.
All times essentially outweighting them. You know, all those imperial powers said, we can't be defeated militarily. That was true. The problem is the Afghans lived there, and the British, the Russians, the Americans did not. And fundamentally, they simply decided, you know, the cost, the domestic policy, whenever they pulled out. And to some extent, that's what Afghanistan, the Taliban are doing to Pakistan now. We live here, you don't. So what you going to do about it? And as I say, that represents a real strategic dilemma for Pakistan, is that, and they've spent some Soviet war in the Taliban. They've invested in, those were their allies. Those were the people living in Pakistan. So the difficulty, they thought, is they dominated them when they were in Pakistan, because the Taliban needed them. What they neglected to think is, if they become independent, if they don't need you anymore, will that past affection be reciprocated? And historically, it will not, right? And they're good readers of history. They could have looked at this and seen. But even in the late 1980s, Pakistan wanted to sign an agreement, or thought about signing an agreement with the Najib government, the communist government, as the Russians were pulling out. And their Afghan allies, the Mujahideen, said, no, you can't possibly do that, and you should go for victory, do this or that. It certainly probably would have been better for most of the world had some kind of coalition government come into existence as the Soviets were pulling out. But given that was the Cold War, the United States didn't believe the Soviets were really doing this. They also didn't care about regional stability. So opportunities were lost in terms of bringing together coalitions that might serve each other's interests, but were never allowed to emerge. So effectively what we've had in Afghanistan is either very radical governments that have come out of insurgencies, or governments that is supported by foreign powers that have found it difficult to maintain their hold on Afghanistan. They can control most of it, but they have no Afghan army has ever defeated an insurgency in its own country, nor has it ever kept foreigners from invading it. So it's because in some sense it kind of shows you the limits of a conventional army in a place like Afghanistan.
Right.
It's good for parades. It's good for show. It's show. As soon as the Taliban took over, they immediately began dressing their troops in American uniforms, and marching around, riding in American Humvees and stuff. It's like you did not win the war by using this advanced equipment, but as soon as you got it, then yeah, we're a state. We're going to do this. And they also double the size of their army after they won the war. Why should you do that? You should be demobilizing. It's only recently they've been reducing the size of their army because they can't afford it anymore. I mean, they have real financial problems because they have no outside aid. And, while they've done a better job than the last government in collecting taxes. The tax base is pretty small. The Afghan economy, lost about 40% of its GDP because 40% of it was foreign aid. That's a pretty big hit for any country.
Yeah, and what's been interesting is that all the weaponry that Taliban acquired, that the US left behind, is now being used against Pakistan in these border clashes. And Pakistan has, of course, accused India of working with the Taliban in coordinating these attacks. But I want to get an idea of your understanding of India's play when it comes to Afghanistan, because despite having Pakistan in the middle, India and Afghanistan have shared close relations for years. And it doesn't matter whether you've had the communists in power, you've had the Mujahideen in power, now you have the Taliban in power, because as many people were shocked to see that Taliban's acting foreign minister came to India, and he held some major diplomatic meetings in New Delhi. He was allowed to go to a small town in Uttar Pradesh called Deoband, from where the Deobandi Islamic ideology comes from. Taliban said that their roots come from Deoband. So India's role has been very fluid, but also very engaged when it comes to dealing with Afghanistan.
Yes, it has. And to some extent, the fact that India doesn't border Afghanistan creates an easier opportunity for that, because you're not going to have conflicts over land or problems of people crossing the border. Also, and the new war in Iran is going to create a problem for this. India invested very heavily in the port of Charbahar in Iranian
Right.
Baluchistan and built a road to Afghanistan in order to Indian goods could get in and out of Central Asia. That they broke Pakistan's monopoly on access to landlocked Afghanistan by sea, because now Charbahar being a modern port and with decent roads, you didn't have to go through Karachi. And that had always been a stranglehold that Pakistan had on Afghanistan. And India built the infrastructure to go via Iran. So, and it allowed, particularly during the Republic, but it allowed the Afghans more strategic opportunity to ignore what Pakistan wanted, because they had alternate ways of getting stuff in and out of the country. Also, they were looking potentially at markets in the Gulf and in Iran, because a very large number of expatriate Afghans, as well as Pakistanis, they work in the Gulf. So one of the things that's happened over the past 40 years is much stronger relations between the Gulf and Afghanistan than ever existed before. And part of that is air links, but part of that is, the trade links that India financed to link Afghanistan with those Iranian ports.
Brilliant. Thank you for these wonderful insights, Thomas. It was truly a pleasure speaking to you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.